Good morning, everyone. I'm so glad that you all are able to join us this morning for the As the South Has Something to Say webinar. We're here with you this morning to bring a dynamic conversation that is set from the perspective of the South. We have all been working hard, making sure our communities are safe and protected, and we really need to share conversations and connect with you all so we can sort of frame how we need to be moving in the South and how we need you all to engage with us in bridging this work. And so this morning we have a beautiful dynamic panel that's here to share with you their work, the strategies that they've been working on, and the things that they want us to have a call to action around. And so we're glad that we have this opportunity to be in front of you all. And we're going to start off with just giving the panel the opportunity to introduce themselves. And so each panel member will have the opportunity, have a minute to really say who they are, their organization, and why it's important for them to be a part of this conversation this morning. And I'm going to volunteer Nathaniel Smith to go first.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for participating on this webinar. My name is Nathaniel Smith, and I serve as the founder and chief equity officer of the Partnership of Southern Equity. And why am I participating on this call? I'm participating on this call because the South has something to say. And I believe that we will have an opportunity to say what needs to be said on this call.
Thank you so much, Nathaniel. Helen?
Hi, my name is Helen Chin. I'm the Director of Sustainable Environments at the Cerdna Foundation. We're a family foundation that's based in New York City, but we fund across the country. We've been around for 102 years. And one of the things that the family has been mindful to do is really figure out how to embed racial equity and justice into the core elements of our work. Why the South has always mattered to us is that we see it as a place that a lot of the disparities that we see and racial inequality actually is rooted in the South. But one of the things that we have noticed transcend over time is that the South always remains a resilient place and a place of creativity and innovation to think through how to dismantle a lot of the racist institutions that exist. Why I'm participating on this call today is to hold community close and really work with philanthropy in the public sector and our grassroots partner to talk about like what is a transformation that we can envision given this new unnatural reality that we have with COVID.
Thanks so much, Helen. Elena?
Sure, good afternoon. I'm Elena Conley. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer for the Babcock Foundation. We are a Southern Regional Family Foundation based in the South, will always be in the South. And so for us, this conversation is critical to continue the relationship building and the focus on social change work that we have done over the last 60 years. You know, we're a family foundation that really focuses on systems change work with an explicit racial equity lens. And so for us today is an exciting conversation and to continue to build relationships and deepen the work that's happening across the region.
Wonderful, thank you, Elena. Miho?
Hello, everyone. My name is Mio Vodopich. I'm a Senior Program Officer at the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. We're based in Chicago, and I work in our Climate Solutions Program. And for me, participating today, you know, one, I want to continue to send a message to my peers and partners that when we think about equity, particularly in the South, it's not a tactic or an approach, but it's really a set of values that we need to embed in all that we do. With respect to our work specifically on climate change, we've realized that the more equitable considerations that we can make when we think about solutions, that means the deeper emissions and the broader positive change that we could see happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miho. Mayor Ingram?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dina Holiday Ingram, Mayor of the great city of East Point, where there's no point like East Point, and I am honored to be a part of this amazing panel today to have this conversation around, I think, how the critical sense of urgency around equity has manifested itself through COVID-19 pandemic. I think during this time of unprecedented uncertainty, it is critically important to be clear to most everyone that people matter and that we have to make decisions that are driven for and by people. And so for us, as we're looking at equity and inclusion and coming up with a strategic plan through the working with PSC, really focusing on how, as we develop, we can make sure that we are developing with our residents and not to them, and making sure that we are, really having this people-focused approach to meet the needs of our residents. And I think that is required through the intentional journey of equity. And I know that it will totally transform the way development is done, not only in our city, but I think it will be a model for the country as well. And so I'm excited to be on this call with all of these amazing panelists and look forward to engaging today.
Thank you so much, Mayor Ingram. Lisa?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lisa Medellin, and I am the Director of Programs with Healthcare Georgia Foundation. We are based here in Atlanta, in downtown Atlanta, and the foundation funds across the state of Georgia. We do about $3.6 million a year annual in grant making. That can vary from year to year. And this particular issue is at the root and the cornerstone of the work of the foundation. It has been elevated to another level for us in the past 12 months or so as a result of a strategic plan that the foundation adopted, calling out equity very intentionally. It's very much a part of some of our place-based grant making, particularly in rural Georgia. And so my desire to be here and a part of this conversation today is to be a part of a group to elevate the discussion, the conversation about equity, about the South, and hopefully to be a part of a conversation that looks at sharing ideas, looking towards solutions and how we can serve each other better.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lisa. Tyler.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's so good to be with you. I am calling into this conversation from the mountains of West Virginia, where I normally live in DC, but am out here riding out the storm that we're all in. And there goes my cat who was on my lap. I'm really appreciative of this conversation, and thank you to GSP and PSC and Nonprofit Quarterly for having us today. I think it's going to be a really excellent discussion. And then, I'm also excited to be with this esteemed group of panelists, many of whom I've had a chance to work with over the last several years. I was raised in Nashville, came from the South, and have the pleasure of working in the region for quite some time. I currently work at Amalgamated Bank. We're the country's largest socially responsible bank, started nearly 100 years ago. We were founded by immigrant women laborers in the Garment District of New York, who needed a financial institution to serve them and their community. And that DNA very much carries forward into our work today, where we're active in pushing out our resources and the political capital we have to fight for a more just and sustainable world. The South, for me, has always mirrored the kind of extraction and oppression that our country was founded on. Most obviously with slavery, but sharecropping, mountaintop mining in Appalachia, oil and gas extraction in Louisiana, and much more show how our country has benefited from the inequalities that were based here in the South. But the South also represents home for me. It also represents hope for me, because our people are resilient. They're strong, they're knowing. Our land is abundant, our cultural ties are strong. And I'm excited to utilize all of the resources of the bank to support this effort. We have deep ties in the region and are active in deploying our investable capital, our philanthropic capital, and our reputational capital to fight for a more just and equitable South as it progresses. And I think if this moment teaches us anything, is that we can't go back to normal, that we have to move forward and be different. And the South is the best place in our country to push that forward. So with that, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Tyler. And Tanae Trailer.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Nathaniel, Tamika, so much for having us here. You know, I'm with an organization called the Candida Fund. We're a private foundation located here in Atlanta, but we fund nationally and internationally on a variety of different issues, centering the transformation of individuals and leaders and big ideas. The other thing that's probably unique than any of the other foundations that are on the call today is that we're also headed to a spend out. So we have you know, this epidemic is only heightening our sense of urgency around our work centered on equity. The other reason why I'm here, and not only because Tamika and Nathaniel wrote an amazing article, not just talking about the South, they are from the South, they are children of the South during this time, and we needed to hear those voices right now. We need these leaders to step up. So I am more than happy to serve and participate with you guys today. And the last thing is that, you know, Nathaniel opens the article with, and why we're here today, that said the South has something to say. And, you know, I also think that as we place equity at the center of this conversation, we must also insist that that the South also has something to do. And I think that's a part of today's call is creating a space for us to be adamant on the solutions for our communities. So I'm really grateful to be here to hang out with my friend that I actually have not seen in a while. So I'm selfishly here looking at all the faces that I haven't seen and enjoying that as we're all transitioning in this crazy world. Our new world will be, you know, pre and post pandemic. I can't believe we're saying that, but thank y'all for having us.
Thank you so much. And I just again want to thank all of you for taking time out of your day to be a part of this conversation. And again, my name is Tamika Mosley. I'm with Grantmakers for Southern Progress. And this conversation is important to me because it's an opportunity for us to start moving together so that we can ground ourselves and ground our work and making sure that every citizen in this South has an opportunity to envision and build their dreams in the way that they want to and have the opportunity to. And so I'm just glad that we have the time and space to be here with you all. And we're going to jump straight in. But before we do, I want to give us a couple of house rules. One, please feel free to take breaks. Please feel free to grab some lunch, grab coffee, and just hanker down with us for the next hour and a half. There will be an opportunity at the end of the call for us to ask questions. And so there will be a chat. Please make sure you enter all your questions in the chat, and we will have those questions lifted up towards the end of the conversation. And we'll also give our panelists an opportunity to ask you all some questions to sort of make sure you're getting out of this, the call to action to direct you after you get off of this call. So with that being said, I'm actually going to turn the conversation over to Nathaniel, who's going to take a moment this morning to sort of frame the article and frame why we thought it was important to do this article at this time, and sort of frame this conversation that will be the discussion that we'll be going into.
Thank you, Tamika. And I will be as brief as I can. I want to make sure that we have an opportunity to help to facilitate a rich conversation with our panelists. The reason why Tamika and I felt the urgency around the need for an article like The South Has Something to Say is that right now, as on many occasions in the past, we are in a very unique moment, a moment in America where we all know that it will never be the same, but we are in a moment where we can either progress forward as a more inclusive society, or we can continue to devolve into a nation of greed and a lack of empathy for individuals that are suffering in our communities. And just like we've had opportunities at other times in America's history where we could have had a chance to move forward, and sometimes we've had a chance to leverage that, you know, whether it be all the way back to Reconstruction or whether it be even more recent, the mortgage crisis of 2008. There are these moments in time where if we are organized and have an ability to move forward, great and positive things can happen. Unfortunately, on many occasions, the individuals that are actively engaged in making change occur, in our opinion, have had selective amnesia about the role that the American South has played in advancing America, the history of struggle that individuals have had to face, in particular communities of color and more specific Black communities since 1619, when slaves arrived here in Virginia, or the history of our indigenous populations with the Trail of Tears and the pushing out and marginalization of our Native American populations, and even today, our Latino community and others, while at the same time, examples of how organizations and leaders have risen out of these challenges and assisted in creating not only a better South, not only a better nation, but a better world. On many occasions, this work, this resilience, this genius, this infrastructure has been forgotten by not only philanthropy, but even sometimes, unfortunately, forgotten by the people who live in the South. And so we wanted to leverage this moment as an opportunity to level set, to not only talk about the past and how we got here, and not only the present. As we can see, for the past 50 years, much of the resistance that has come from America moving forward through public policy has manifested itself through Southern policy and Southern politicians, or even in the future, what is possible if we choose to hold on to this moment and leverage this moment. We believe that now is the time, and that if we are to move forward and really leverage the unfortunate occurrence of COVID-19, we have to understand that the South and leaders in the South must play a critical and pivotal role in advancing the nation forward. And so when we say so goes the South, so goes the nation, we believe again that the occurrences that consistently happen in America and consistently happen in the South continue to speak to that reality. And we hope that through the op-ed that we developed, as well as this panel, we will have a chance to not only talk about it, but be about it. And so that is why we wrote the article, and we hope that this panel will be a continuation of that conversation, and even more important, inspire people to act.
Thank you so much, Nathaniel. And I think that is a wonderful way to segment into our opening discussion. We brought each of you here because we know that you are all doing work in your respective spheres around advancing equity. One of my mentors once said to me, the best thing that you could do, and regardless of what position you sit in, is to be an organizer and to be active in making sure that you're working for the benefit of our community. And so with that being said, my first question to all of you is, in your organization, what are you doing to advance equity in your sphere of influence, from your sphere of influence?
So one of the things that so hi everybody again to everyone. And I wanna sort of lead off with that question. Nathaniel, and I also wanna take a moment of appreciation for the grounding that you've laid out before us around the role that the South plays. And I think it's really important to highlight the fact that the commodification of bodies, Black and Brown and Indigenous bodies, that is rooted deeply in the history within the South. And I think one of the things that often is lost, specifically within philanthropy, as we think about how our wealth was manifested, it's parallel to how the wealth of the nation was manifested. It was off of the souls and the blood of Black and Brown communities. So I think when we think about how to be in right relationship to addressing racial inequity, we actually need to have an analysis about that and be forward leaning around what was our role and how can we correct that. At CERDNA, one of the things that was like really telling for the family was like when we had new leadership come into the institution, there was this moment to really be reflective of like, what is the legacy that we want to be behind, behind. Like at the time we were 90 years old. And ironically, the family, when they thought about what they wanted to do, they were just like, well, we're here for charitable reasons. We're here to give back. And I think many of the staff pushed them on that. Like, what does it mean to give back? And move beyond charity and actually think about what it means to be in solidarity with the people who we say we are here to serve, understanding there's an acknowledgement of, again, we made our wealth off of those people. So in like 2010, one of the things that we were really reflective around is like how to embed social justice into the work. At the same time, the staff was going through a bit of an evolution, and what you saw was a lot of diversity come into the organization. And again, there was this push from staff to actually dig deeper and think about what it actually means, given that a lot of the institutional voices in the at CERDNA were actually brown and Black folks. We were just like, if we're not embedding race and not being thoughtful around the role that race plays in all aspects of our work. So while my portfolio is around environment, there's a deep understanding that in order to address climate inequities, environmental inequities, we actually need to think holistically around what does justice mean? And it is not just episodic toward the environment. It's around all aspects of our life, understanding that what's deeply rooted to those inequities is this framework around that we can commoditize Black and brown bodies, again, from an economic standpoint, that ultimately then have an impact on the environment. All the programs sort of got behind that. And I think what we were also seeing at the same time, and why the South, because we know we were doing a few things in the South, but where we decided like we really had to begin to pay attention is that everything that when we talk about the erosion around our democracy, the impact on people, all of that sadly is like the South is the epicenter, but also a living laboratory of like how we are going to erode our democracy. So the first thing that we saw was like climate disasters coming through, whether it be Katrina, and how Black and brown bodies did not matter. And they were an afterthought in that catastrophe. Then we saw Shelby and Holder in 2013, like the rollback of voting rights. All of these things started to hit us at CERDNA. And then we really thought about like, if we were going to be intentional around living into the values that we espouse around justice and equity, we really needed to be more mindful of actually supporting the leadership that was rooted within the South, and see that leadership as the connective tissue to be able to really secure the broader democracy that we wanted to have for the country, because that's where much of the innovation and the creativity was coming from. So as CERDNA thinks about the role that we want to be able to play and how we're living into those values, what is core to that is really supporting the leadership within the South. But the other thing is really trying to be, again, in right relationship with people of color and those communities we say we're here to serve, and being an advocate to push on our philanthropic and public sector partners to, again, be in right relationship with these communities.
Tamika, just to piggyback on what, I hate the word piggyback, why did I say that? Just to continue and support Helen's framing, a few things, I've been in philanthropy for quite some time now, and the nature of organizing at this level and within colleagues who often get in this work, to Helen's original point on this this benevolent space. Like, people are in this because, of whatever reason that's benevolent, which is wonderful. However, benevolence is not necessarily the radical mind frame or values that we need for the shift and the huge disparities that have plagued us for so long. I think oftentimes we want to shortcut our way to solutions and shortcut our way to some type of magical ending that makes people feel good. And I just don't think that is what we need to do. And you know, I find myself a lot of times, sometimes being the voice at the table and, you know, particularly being here and seeing the nature of my colleagues that are investing in the South or not investing in the change work that I think is so relevant to what we all need. And I'm also seeing the mindset and the framing in which we're, like, for example, you know, during this COVID situation, there's this huge need for us to react to the direct needs and responding to the health crisis. And that's exactly right. And we need our foundations to do that. But what I'm also seeing is the short-sightedness of how these foundations are not going to be able to pivot to the systemic changes that's going to be needed in the fall, in 2021, in 2022, after we've provided all the PPP support and the food support. You know, a lot of the challenges that we're dealing with now because of this health epidemic, and I'm really curious to hear what Lisa has to say, is because we have not invested in the healthcare systems for folks to have the quality access to healthcare. So we're not dealing with just a health crisis. We're dealing with huge systemic problems that, I'm gonna be honest with you, a lot of funders that are based in the South are just not equipped to do. Less than, I think it's 2% of all funding in the South goes to social justice support. I mean, we are at a deficit here when it comes to really changing the disparities in our community. So, you know, as I think about our work at Candida and us advancing these and supporting the voices of not only individuals that are doing the work, but of individuals who look like the people that they're doing the work with and for. So it is important for us to put our dollars into women-led, Black-led, Brown-led work. And so that's the level of action that I'd like to see philanthropy insist upon, and you know, from my vantage point, so we can then have, I think a part of this equity thing is that it's not just about having a conversation. I love a good conversation. But when we start to look at the data and we start to see wealth inequality increase so rapidly with all of this philanthropy happening, sometimes I ask myself, are we a part of the solution or are we part of the problem? You know, we just can't, pretend that these things aren't happening. So when I think of organizing, to your original question, is that we've got to figure out how to insist that our colleagues in philanthropy are directing those resources at the change organizations that are really shifting the needle from widening the gap to really helping to, I don't want to be too cliche, but are helping to bridge those huge disparities that continue to plague our community. So I just think we have, for those of us that are around this table that work in philanthropy, I think we need to spend a lot more, a better sense of our time talking to our colleagues about ways that they can be better investment partners to organizations like PSC, like the Land Trust, and like other organizations that were lifted up in the article across the South.
So I guess since Tanae called me out to
I surely did, Lisa.
I think that means I'm next, right? Okay.
That's right.
So a couple of thoughts running through my head to the question, but also to Tanae's comment. So my collective thought about the time that we're in terms of COVID-19, and my professional career has been healthcare has been a part of my professional career from the very beginning. And having worked some time in the nonprofit sector and now on the other side of this. And so what came to my mind as COVID-19 started to emerge was the idea that the veil has now been lifted. Or some folks, you know, say the chickens have come home to roost. Because to the point, in terms from a health perspective, all of the things that we've heard about for years in terms of health disparities, health inequities, social determinants of health, all those things have now because there hasn't been an appropriate investment in our healthcare infrastructure, and particularly in our public health infrastructure, we now see the byproduct of that. That when you have a pandemic such as COVID-19, there are things now that are just, it's unimaginable that we're in this space and that people are sick and dying, largely due to being unprepared and largely due to lack of investment in our public health infrastructure and a whole myriad of other poor policies that have existed for centuries. And so when you think about that in that context, and then the question around the equity issue, I think there's two ways that I think about this. One is from the perspective, obviously, of where I sit in my role with Healthcare Georgia Foundation and what we've been doing prior to COVID-19 is the investment in terms of those communities that largely are left out of the discussion, and that's largely the small towns and rural areas, which in many cases are predominantly African American, and even more so brown people of Latino descent. And so they are largely out of that conversation and what's happening in community. And so because the foundation, through its Two Georgias initiative, decided to invest in allowing the community to be at the table, to create and to evolve what it is that they thought would work in their community, and to engage from the perspective of the equity lens. And so that has been, I think, a tremendous advantage for those communities now that this COVID-19 has presented itself. I don't have any concrete data, but I would say that many of them are probably better equipped to be able to collectively pull together community engagement, community response, because they've been doing this for some time now. I would also say that when you look at how this is played out in certain areas of the state and what has happened in terms of those communities that's been affected more with deaths and so forth, again, I think we can very easily revert back to the old way of doing business if we're not careful. If we don't see this as a situation from which we can learn and from which we can help community, because in my thought, it's about not necessarily what philanthropy can always do, but how do we make sure we're making community have a voice at the table in all aspects. And sometimes that has meant us pushing those communities to make sure those residents are there. The second part of my comment before I leave this is has to do with around philanthropic sector. And that has become, I think, more important. I agree with Tanae in that way. It's why I lend some of my time to two groups that are statewide groups, the Georgia Grantmakers Alliance, and a new group, the Georgia's Funders Network for Racial Equity. Because those spheres are places where funders are getting together and starting to have and engage in conversation about equity and how, as a grant maker, and whatever space they show up as a funder, whether it's a private foundation, a family foundation, whether you focus on health, education, or whatever, how is it that you can use your work and your knowledge, skills to make sure that you're doing things and that are encouraging equity, that are supporting and funding organizations that can do that can work with these communities. And that includes everything. It includes funding to those organizations who are limited resources, led by people of color, who may not always meet our litmus tests, but certainly have the commitment of the community, the passion and the desire to get something done. And so that's a part of, I think to Tanae's comment about how do we get philanthropy to see this and how they can do things differently. I think COVID-19 has presented that opportunity as well, because many funders that I've spoken to have had to, including us, we've dismantled our traditional grant-making strategies and policies, made them more relaxed and more flexible. And there can be some learning from that going forward to see how maybe we might look at, as a sector, how we do business and how we do grant-making to make those options more available to those organizations that don't always rise up to the top in terms of the short list of who to fund.
And I'll just chime in here, having heard the discussions around philanthropy, you know, from my perspective as the mayor of a city and in government, you know, oftentimes as we think about economic development, we think of models that historically, systemically, and, you know, institutionally have resulted in involuntarily displacing people, legacy residents and legacy businesses that have been in communities for decades before, you know, someone decides, oh, this is a great place. And, you know, if we, in this era, in this time, if we continue to develop in that way and expect a different result, to me, that's insanity. We've all heard insanity is doing the same thing and expecting a different result. And so, you know, I feel it's incumbent upon me and us in this position to really change the way people think about development. We've always heard of P3 as it relates to economic development, public-private partnerships. But this idea of the P4 is coming up, public-private philanthropic partnerships, right? For community development, not just economic development, but community development. How do we develop communities with people to make sure that what we're bringing into that community is actually improving the quality of life and enhancing and respecting the residents and businesses that are there. And so oftentimes people say, you know, gentrification is synonymous with revitalization or redevelopment. I think that's fundamentally false, and that we have to think of the fact that we can revitalize and redevelop our communities through an equity lens, right? Through a way of looking at development in a way that really helps meet the needs of our community. And so what are we doing to advance equity within the city of East Point? We partner with Partnership for Southern Equity and are working on a strategic equity and inclusion plan to look at three primary areas, like as umbrellas, but a lot of things within that, focusing on economic inclusion, inclusionary housing, and industrial redevelopment. And so our forefathers thought that East Point would be like this very industrial place, but even they changed their minds as well and realized we needed to pivot. I just read The Color of Law, and it talked about, you know, redlining and how communities of color were placed close to, you know, environmentally unsafe, hazardous, you know, areas to live. And then, you know, then we find ourselves now during COVID-19 talking about, again, the health disparities that plague the Black and brown communities. And so, you know, really it's trying to get the root cause. What are those social determinants of health? How do we systemically address them? Through our policies, how are we intentional about it? Because equity is not just a cliche, it's a very intentional, people-focused act. And for me, it is, you know, leveraging my network, my influence, my relationships, and our resources to do just that, to come up with something different, to create a different model, to show people that it can be done. And fortunately, I feel like what COVID is showing is that it must be done. I don't think we have a choice anymore. Right? We can continue to have these conversations, but COVID-19 is really a life or death proposition. We're not talking about making widgets. We're not talking about, you know, whether or not we can be more competitive in providing a good or a service. These people are either gonna live or die based upon the decisions that we make at the policy level. And if we as elected officials and people in government can't put people over politics and can't put people over profit at this time, the question becomes, I don't know when that's going to happen. But for me, I know that is what I believe, and that is how I govern, and that is how I approach the different opportunities that come our way. And so, you know, the demographics of my city also require that I think this way. We're a city that's about 76% African-American, 16% white. We have about 10 or 11% Hispanic, a significant LGBTQIA population. Like, we're a very diverse community. Not only in our people, we're multi-generational, we have a diverse housing stock. I mean, those are all assets. Our diversity is truly our strength, but we won't maintain that if we are not intentional about the way we move forward and the way we develop and the way our ordinances kind of really put out a roadmap as to where we desire to end up. And so, Again, we're thankful to partner with Partnership for Southern Equity, but it is really this P4 model of community development that not just, you can't just focus on money. Like if people aren't there to spend money, then the money doesn't matter. Like it doesn't, the system doesn't work, right? So it has to be a community development focus that also encompasses economic development, but it's a balancing of all of that with a people focused and a people driven perspective to really make sure that equity happens.
So I think one of the pieces that we learned through COVID-19, but we knew fundamentally as a foundation, is that relationships matter. And so one of the pieces that we understood is not only relationships matter in this region, but in building the infrastructure. So I think one of the conversations we have always had as a foundation is how do we support capacity building, long-term funding to organizations that are in directly impacted communities, listening to communities of color and building authentic relationships so that when a crisis happens like COVID, communities are able to pivot and we're able to then work directly in relationship with communities to respond to their needs. So one of the pieces I think about is how we were able to pivot as a foundation and respond quickly to grantees' needs. And it was only because we were in relationship. We were only able to have conversations and understand how to effectively support with grant dollars quickly, nimbly, is because of the trusted relationships we've had over the last 20 years. And so for us, one of the pieces that we constantly ask philanthropy, particularly Southern philanthropy and philanthropy that comes down into the region, is building long-term lasting relationships with grantees and building long-term infrastructure that will last. So I think we have this notion oftentimes in philanthropy that we expect organizations to pivot quickly when there's crisis or there's opportunity without investing in them in the front end to help them build the capacity to be able to do that. And so for us, we see COVID is significant impact to community, but our grantees are also sharing significant opportunities, particularly with policy opportunities, with building power with communities across the region, because we've been able to seed and support what they've needed over the last 20 years. And so for us, to connect it to that, advancing equity in our sphere of influence has really been rooted in the last 20 years of investment in continuing to sustain it in the middle of this pandemic.
Well, I just want to echo so much of what my colleagues have said already, starting with Helen's analysis around the commodification and control of Black bodies, to Tanae's point around where philanthropy is headed in this moment, and Mayor Ingram, I thought your point around if we can't figure out, and I'm going to butcher what you said, so please bear with me, but if we can't figure out, how we prioritize people over capital, or people over business itself now, how will we ever be able to do that in the future? And so much of the work that we're thinking about is in that similar vein. And so it's encouraging to hear those questions being raised from different parts of the country. There's just two small contributions I'd make to this discussion, because so much of what has been said, I totally agree with. The first is that, at Amalgamated Bank and with our foundation, we are ever more convinced that philanthropy's endowments need to get off the sidelines. I don't know a better set of circumstances to move people than the one that is in front of us, but we can no longer continue to hoard 95%, spend 5%, and hope the world will change. That's just fundamentally not going to happen. And it is moments like this and instability like this that new ideas come to the forefront, new opportunities come to the forefront. And I'm excited to see some of that already start to emerge. And I would just hope that philanthropic CIOs, CFOs stay open to those new opportunities to utilize those endowments in a way that certainly have return, but also make impact. Because all the money sitting over here while we're trying to fight over here doesn't really make a lot of sense, and it will not get us far. So that's the first question and the first kind of opportunity that I see. The second one is for fellow corporations and those in the private sector. There was a lot of conversation last year heading into this crisis around the role of stakeholders and shareholders in how businesses should consider decisions. And you know, what has been most kind of interesting in this moment is that many of our businesses are relying on essential workers to stay open. And those essential workers are often the lowest paid with the least rights and abilities in our workforces. And so what does it look like for the corporations to flip the paradigm on its head? And if essential workers are actually essential, pay them and care for them as such. And so I think we're excited to see, you know, some of the long-held beliefs within the corporate sector start to get rattled around as simple as paid family leave and paid sick leave, which was not universal to everyone, and all the way to how do we care for our workers when themselves and their lives are threatened by this pandemic. There's a long way to go in that field, but we need to go beyond just a kind of typical corporate social responsibility approach here and really think about the power of our corporations financially and politically as a tool to make change in our communities. So thank you.
I'd like to just add a few things. One, I want to thank everybody here who's been saying. I find I often don't say much, but I listen a lot, and I've been learning from all of you. So it's been very helpful. I think for philanthropy in particular, it's not just the resources we have, but it's also the reputations we have and the Rolodex we have. And so I've been trying to tell my grantees, there's 3 things you should be asking from me all the time. For more money, for more introductions, and to use our name in order to advance what you all are doing. And it's all those 3 things where certainly MacArthur is trying to improve and embed better how we think about equity. And I think, when I reflect along my peers here, we as an institution have a long way to go. I myself have a long way to go, and it is a journey that we need to take. And it isn't just about who we write the checks to, but it's also the time, where we're spending, and also, who are we allowing to use our good names, again, hopefully to advance what they're doing. When I think about particularly the COVID crisis, this is, as others have referred, it's the latest mirror that we're holding up to ourselves, to our society. And, MacArthur, I get the privilege to work internationally, and, the South and what it will decide to do, not just what it has to say, is going to be heard, and it's going to reverberate across the globe. This has been this part of the region, for the U.S. has always been a leader in terms of advancing civil rights. And believe me, there are people all over the world that look to the South, to the leadership here, to what people are doing here on the ground as motivation about what they should be doing in their own countries and their own communities across the globe. Maybe the last thing I'll say is, within philanthropy, and I think this has been a stereotype, be it about the South or other parts of the world, where we'll say things like, oh, well, there's organizations, but, they just can't take on this issue. They're not ready. They don't have the capacity. And to me, I think what I want to say to my peers and to others is that, well, it sounds like you got 2 checks to write. You need to write that check to help invest in that capacity, build that leadership, ensure that those organizations are financially sound and that they're sustainable. And then also thinking about what is it that they're trying to accomplish in terms of really changing their own communities and what they're trying to advance.
I appreciate you all lifting up all those various perspectives around why you are moving the work in this way to advance equity in the South. And I know that there are some questions in the chat that we'll definitely get to and lift those up back to the panel. But I want to just take us, before we start talking about strategy, want to give you each a minute to just talk a little bit or dig a little bit into your work and how your work is broadening the equity agenda in the South. It's important for us to think about, even if you look at the panel that's here today, we have different sectors that are here, and we have to think about how we pull together to get this work done. And so it's really important for us to also lift up what the work is from your perspective, and what are some of those examples of the work that you all are doing to advance an equity agenda in the South.
Tamika, if it's okay, I'd like to jump in really quickly. I mean, for the Candida Fund, for the past, I would say 15 years or so, we've been investing in this conversation around new economy and community wealth building. And I know this is an area also where PSC is really looking at economic justice as a part of its overall work, and we're so proud to be a partner. But for the Candida Fund, we've, I would say I'll look at it at a macro, kind of like what we're doing nationally. We've made some very significant investments around worker ownership and cooperative economics that I'm really excited about. We've done some really localized work across the country and native country in the South and in the Bronx and everywhere. So that work is just really special. And in Atlanta and in the South, we're really pushing this narrative around how do we support Black economies in a meaningful and powerful way. For us, we're starting with how do we help invest in the hyper-local economy in Atlanta. We've long dealt with divestment, as it relates to gentrification. And so for us, it's around not just the housing displacement, but what do we do about the economic displacement that happens in our community? So we're investing in a coalition. We're also investing in a variety of ways in which we can really look at how are we lifting up economic justice. And we're locking arms with folks from across the South and from across the country to really lift this up. So, we're standing up organizations. We're hoping to expand the conversation with our other grantees. I think two critical investments that we've made around, one is how do we demonstrate that? So we've invested in a beautifully young group called the Village Micro Fund that are doing cooperative investing that with also an emphasis on sustainability of what that looks like in communities. So really proud of that young group that is actually looking at residents and neighbors to co-invest in locally owned businesses. So whether it's $50 or $500, you are a stakeholder and you get a return on that investment. It's not necessarily a new concept, but it's one that's organized in the Atlanta community that is pretty powerful. And the other one is the Atlanta Wealth Building Initiative that's looking to really help demonstrate innovative products that we can use, whether it's in partnership with our CDFI around character-based lending, whether it's looking at permanent commercial affordability. What are those models? What are those very specific things that we can invest in besides debt? But debt also is important to demonstrate, like, how do we can't just talk about economic power. We've got to kind of do it. Philanthropy has got to pivot and start to invest differently. And that means that we're investing alongside Black and brown entrepreneurs. And that's a powerful way for us to use our philanthropy, but also investing in the nonprofits that are providing those business solutions for, and that's also in partnership with our neighborhoods and our communities. So for us, again, and we've been doing it for a while, but, we're also looking at housing and all these other things that our colleagues will talk about, but really supporting economic justice is something that I think we're trying to lift up right now locally.
And one of the things, and Tanae, thanks for that. I want to build off of that, and much of what's been talked about writ large on the things that our philanthropic institutions hold. I think where there is alignment across the board is a deep understanding that in order for us to actually dismantle the racist institutions and systems that exist, a structural change will be needed. And for Surdna, what that looks like is like, how do we build power and support the organizations that are attempting to build community power? Because for us, in order for the change that we seek, which a lot of what we've been thinking about is like how do we actually get to stronger political power? How do we get to stronger cultural and social power? Like, it's just rooted in folks need power. Within our own individual program, a lot of that, what that looks like is how do you shift who actually has control, stewardship, and ownership around the land, around systems that move from all the way from economic power to who has the standing and the opportunity to define what actually happens in their community and the ability to self-determine. So much of what we've done, and I'm sort of chiming into some of the chats that I'm seeing on the side, people have asked for specifics on the who and then what it has looked like. So from an institutional perspective, I think one of the things that we work to do is get the board to a place where they had an understanding around the pivot from focusing on these large national organizations that were really working around and tinkering around the fringes around the issues that we care about. So like for my program, it was environment. So it was nice to fund energy efficiency, and potentially those benefits would trickle down to folks who, from a pocketbook standpoint, but what we inherently knew was that actually wasn't the systems change that was needed, because people actually didn't have any energy democracy. They didn't have control over what was happening. So once we were able to make that shift within our institution, the next thing that we did was our program has been very intentional about shifting dollars to making sure that we are funding organizations that are led by people of color, and that are deeply rooted in the communities that we are seeking to serve. So the majority of our portfolio, which is about probably 85% now, is mostly going to organizations that are led by Black and Brown folks. The other thing that we've done is really opened up how those dollars go out the door. So they're no longer project support, they're all general operating to the extent that they can be. The only time it is not general operating is when the organizations don't have the fiscal means to take those dollars and they ask for it to go through a fiscal agent. And what it has really been centered around is supporting how we, on a couple of fronts, how we build out the ecosystem of leadership within the South. So we're funding organizations such as like One Voice Mississippi, Project South for the South Movement Assembly. We're funding organizations that are really looking at like how do Black and Brown people actually have ownership and control over land. So that will stem from supporting organizations that support a larger network, such as the National Black Food and Justice Alliance, Land Loss Prevention, the Center for Heirs Property, and New Communities, to then also supporting much of the work that we talk about, and sort of what is the root of this conversation is like, how do we reimagine something different? Many of us have been working to build on actualizing the future, a just and sustainable future. But what does that actually look like, and being able to give space for that? I think one of the things, the COVID creates a moment to reimagine something new, but a lot of that work has been happening, and there's an opportunity to be able to build on that. One thing that's really exciting that we've been seeing and been able to be a part of is supporting the Gulf South New Deal work, which is a 5-state coalition that is really reimagining what a new economy would look like that is actually rooted with values around race and class. I think we've had the pleasure of being able to support those organizations. And as COVID, as we transition out of COVID and in the response mode, I think where we'll be going after recovery is that reimagination mode. And you see much of the leadership that all of us have been able to fund actually is the foundation to be able to secure what that reimagination looks like that is really rooted in supporting, again, a just and sustainable future.
I'll go next, Tamika. That's okay. So, in thinking about this question, I think from where I sit, it's kind of a two-prong, because it's pre-COVID-19 and then post-COVID-19. Mm-hmm. Because the foundation, since I've been there, and from its beginning, has always had a interest in addressing the health disparity. So, as you all know, it's a health foundation. So that's there. And so I think what evolved over the years of the foundation was a natural growth towards how does this become more intentional in the grant making, and not just who is awarded a grant, but how that process plays out. because there's a distinction between who you're deciding to give a grant to versus how those decisions are made. And so I think we got to a place where a lot of it came out of a strategic plan, where there was an interest from our board to be more intentional around health equity and call that out in every program that we were going to be doing. And so some of what was already happening, because we had already made an investment, as I said earlier, into an initiative called Two Georgias, was the relationship that we had established with the Partnership for Southern Equity. And working with Nathaniel and his team very intentionally has exposed ourselves, meaning the staff at the foundation, to information, content, resources, different ways of thinking about equity in a more planned and strategic way, if you will, so that it's not just embedded in the one rural program, which is one of our largest investments at this point. It's a 5-year effort funding 11 counties across the state, doing about $1 million each year totally across each 11 communities. But in addition to that, I started to work with our team and unravel how can our other programs that came from a different kind of perspective around the disparity angle to more equity, how can we look at those and how can we be more intentional in embedding that? And some of that meant education for the staff. I mean, I think part of this conversation, that when we were talking earlier about what can foundations do, there has to be an open door to be able to not make an assumption that staff has the knowledge, the resources, the skills to do equity work and to understand it and what it fundamentally means, just because you're a person of color. Because I think what I've learned very quickly, particularly going into rural communities, I am from a city. I grew up in a city. I didn't grow up on a farm, but I've spent lots of time in this work going into rural communities. And what you understand is that a person of color and what they're dealing with in a rural community is very different than someone in an urban community. It's not one is right or wrong or better, it's just different. And you can't go into a space and make an assumption because you have a similar ethnicity that you understand fully what it would mean for them to be addressing equity in that space. All the things that need to happen in terms of power dynamics, all of that emerges as well, but how you might approach it. And so giving tools or giving staff access to information, resources, and tools on how to do that, how to show that up. Nathaniel's always reminding me and myself that equity is a way. And I agree with that, but in order to get to the way, you have to change your thinking. And I think that's more than just simply saying, okay, I know equity is important and this is what we should do. You also have to bring into your psyche other things that help you understand if you're showing up in a certain way in a community, how you can change that. And so, and through the grant making processes in terms of what the foundation has been doing, it's a big part of our work, but it's embedded into all the programming. A big part of what we're seeing is the leadership development. So that comes through the grant making that we're doing. How do you build out leaders? We have a program that's focused on Empower Health, that's focused on the capacity building of nonprofit organizations. Because within those organizations are some of those leaders and who is being brought to that table. So one of the things we've been doing is looking at and being intentional about making sure that a part of the group that's funded, represent organizations that are represented or led by people of color. And also even pushing the envelope in those organizations that may not be necessarily led by people of color, but who is on your board? We've started to ask our grantees to look at that, to consider that. That was one of the internal things that was a shift in terms of our process, because I would venture to say that if you look across many nonprofits, their board of directors doesn't always align with who they're serving in the community. And I think in some communities, the nonprofit sector is almost non-existent and virtually non-existent. I think in metropolitan Atlanta, we're very fortunate in that there is a plethora of nonprofits, but you get outside of metropolitan Atlanta, it doesn't always look that way. And so you have to be open to how who you partner with and who can be a part of that conversation, but how can you help build the nonprofit sector? And some of that is dealing with what's there, but also dealing to what can be done in the pipeline. I think the other thing that's been a huge investment for the foundation and previously and continues to be an area of interest is child and maternal health. Again, from our health lens. Child and maternal health, if you don't know much about it, has huge disparities in terms of the outcomes for mothers of women of color and having children, and death rates. If you looked at the data in the state, you would be astonished. Many of that data is comparison to some third world countries. And it's unconscionable in a state as wealthy as we are that we have women of color still dealing with child and maternal health for a variety of reasons that I don't want to necessarily just get off and digress into in this situation. But I think it's important to understand that because this COVID-19 obviously revealed a lot of the health disparities, you still have to figure out, well, how are we now going to embed that in the work going forward? Whether you're focusing, whether it's a social justice general issue, economic development, because in my mind, all of what has happened is now set the stage for those social determinants of health that they all align to one another. If you pull anyone out, if you pull housing out, education out, the rest of the system will be dysfunctional as well. So you can't just, I think, any longer say, we're just only going to focus on health and we're just only going to focus on this. It's also a calling card to how do you string all those segments of a community together so as a collective, you have a healthy community that's dealing with some of the policy issues that cut across, whether it's poor housing conditions, whether it's lack of jobs or jobs that don't offer health insurance, whatever the string together thing is. I think this has now been a situation in which it's very clear, if you're not aware, that all those social determinants of health link together, and anyone in a community system can be very fragile and can fall apart. And that's what we've seen with COVID-19. I really believe that. That's why we have so many people standing in line who've never had to do that because they've had full-time jobs, but now they have to stand in line to get a box of food.
Thanks, Lisa.
So
we're going to take a few minutes to let folks wrap up their final thoughts because we really want to hear about the work that you all are doing. So Miho, Elena, or Tyler, if there are specific pieces of work that you want to lift up that you all are doing, please do so, and then we'll shift to a strategy conversation.
Sure, maybe I'll follow up with that. One of the, for us, I guess it's on a couple of different levels from MacArthur. I'll talk about us institutionally briefly, and then kind of the program part that I'm in. As some may know, places like MacArthur or foundations of our vintage, we're made up of several different programs, and we have we're about 40-year-old institution. So right now, as MacArthur, we have something we call the Just Imperative that's meant to lead all of our type of decision-making internally, everything from how we're thinking about our investments, how we're thinking about our management, how we're thinking about the contractors we use, as well as how do we do our grant making. And that Just Imperative is animated by the need and the recognition to think about both racial and social equity in all the things we do. And so that's a conversation that's happening with our board, it's happening with our senior leaders, and it's down and folks like myself. And so that's a process that's working its way through. And I think we are trying to be earnest in seeing what we can do as an institution, again, not just in terms of the grant making we do. That's such a small part, as Tyler had noted. Most foundations, and we're one of them, we only give away anywhere between 5 and maybe 8% annually, and we have a vast amount of wealth that we could be thinking about differently, right? And so there's that institutional piece that's underway, and MacArthur is trying to be far more, again, attentive to our own history and what can we be doing moving forward. On our program side, and this is why, I had, as some of you all know, born and raised here in Chicago. So something like segregation is I lived through and understand in a very visceral way. And for me, where the South was in terms of recognition of our program and our climate program, we don't focus on all kinds of solutions. We really are really centered on energy. And the reason that is because that sector, if we could call it, or industry, it's going through a major transformation. And so it's open up and it's an opportunity for us to find a way to think about embedding equity considerations right now as it's changing. Now, to have that happen and to make that work, we need to have different people at the table making the decisions. And so we've taken a position of trying to invest not only in places like PSC, but another major grantee of ours is the Climate and Clean Energy Equity Fund, where we're trying to directly resource organizations that are led by people of color, led by women, led by indigenous leaders, so that they could be at the table as new decisions are being made about what our future energy is looking like. And so that's how the program has been trying to live through that just imperative and make some of those decisions. But again, it's trying to also invest for the long term, not for some particular campaign, not for some particular just moment of legislative opportunity, but saying that these organizations need to be healthy and strong, not just today, but for the forthcoming future.
So for us, we're asking some pretty explicit questions right now around power building. For us, over the last 5 years, as we shifted into a new strategy and new strategic directions that really focuses on 3 areas around civic engagement and democracy, supportive policies and institutions, and economic opportunity, what we have learned from grantees over the last 5 years is that if we don't explicitly ask around how do we build long-term power with communities, the ability for Southern communities to make decisions, whether politically or economically or from a cultural lens, we won't be able to do. And so we, in this moment of COVID and even previously, we're asking ourselves, our board is wrestling with the question, our grantees are supporting us in finding the solutions of how do we build long-term power for communities and what is power for communities. And so this is after we have built a body of work focused on civic engagement and a deeper investment in civic engagement across the region, which for us goes further than just get out the vote strategies and get in electoral strategies. It's really investing in communities, particularly communities of color, Black and Brown communities that are doing deep long-term leadership development, and that is cultural work to really shift how we think about politically engaging in the South. And when I say political, I mean small p political. And so for us, on top of that, it's also asking and leaning into racial equity work explicitly. So who decision makers on our board is, so it's 50% practitioners, 50% family members, who's in our portfolios, so disaggregating data to understand how we're investing in communities and communities of color with this racial equity lens and this power building lens to really understand how do we fundamentally dismantle systems of oppression and then help communities rebuild that is really rooted in what they have identified as key strategies for long-term change across the region.
Thanks, Elena.
And I'll just briefly add, because everyone has heard a lot about abundance of really great work that's happening in the region. I think for Amalgamated, most tactically, we are the financial partner to many social justice organizations throughout the region and foundations. And that puts us in a unique position to support them in their own capacities as an organization, but also kind of look at trends across the region and be a strong ally in better and clearer funding opportunities. Second, we have a corporate foundation of which I'm engaged in and help manage the grant making there. And the South is a key area of our portfolio, where we've made a number of grants to organizations that are working on environmental justice, democracy, and worker rights issues. And I'm excited about that blossoming portfolio of grantees. But I think that there's one kind of broader perspective that we're bringing to the table at Amalgamated, and that is the role of organizing other corporations and financial institutions specifically in advocating for change across the South. in both stopping the bad and helping start the good when it comes to policy issues. So that's why you've seen us stand up for LGBTQ rights in Virginia, in Tennessee, in the Carolinas. We have fought against rollbacks to reproductive justice issues in Alabama and Louisiana. We've supported paid family leave in Texas. And so across the board, we're trying to be in all the states that we're working in, a good corporate citizen that isn't just about doing the right thing, but really driving fundamental change in community to make it more just and more sustainable. So that would be what I would add to this conversation.
So we have, I want to take a moment to say we are almost halfway through. So please, if you feel the need to take a break, do so, take care of your needs. But I want to just take us a minute because we want to give us some time to talk strategy. You know, realizing having strategies that talk about how we build an equitable South is really important. So I want each of you to just take a moment to talk about the lessons that you've learned pre and post COVID, and also the best practices that you guys are putting in place, that we need to put, the best practices that you all are putting in place that will help us think through this long-term strategy and how we change the South during COVID and beyond.
So Tamika, is it okay for me to start?
Yes, that would be great.
So as one of the few non-foundation leaders on the call, I think it's important for me to, at least at this moment, insert up myself in this conversation. I think that while we're hearing the role of philanthropy, which is critical, change has to begin from the bottom up and not the top down. We've got to begin the process of doing what PSC calls growing the equity ecosystem for racial equity in the American South. And that has to require deep investments and support in developing and growing the agency of frontline leaders in organizations to advance the policies and innovations that they want to advance. For the Partnership for Southern Equity is critical for us, and see that as a key component of our work, whether it be through our leadership development programs, like the Just Energy Academy or the Regional Leaders for Equity, Neighborhood Leaders for Equity program, or the other leadership development programs that we help to facilitate. We believe that change must begin with the people in the frontline organizations that should be primarily led by the people who represent the people that are suffering in our communities. The second thing that is critical and important is the fight over the baseline. What do I mean by that? We all have to work to ensure that data and the research and the indicators are utilized in a way to not only tell the right story, but also be used as an organizing strategy that can bring people together to advance racial equity. And so through research, one of the products that we developed many years ago, the Metroliner Equity Atlas, and the continued reports that we do are not just there to provide data, but to also ensure that the community is informing that data, and that data can be leveraged to organize communities in a way that will build power. So how are we creating the new baseline that we will all utilize in order to make decisions about what are the solutions that are needed to move us forward? Critical and important, and as an organization, we do the best we can to do that. And then the last thing that I just wanted to add, Tamika, and you know, of course, you've heard from some of the participants on the call about the opportunities that we've had to partner with some of the funders and friends that we have on this call. The other key thing is, and actually Helen talked about this a little bit, is that we have to meet the community where they are in terms of how they are experiencing injustice. A person in communities that are being marginalized and hurt by structural racism doesn't have a housing problem on Monday and a jobs problem on Tuesday, and an environmental problem on Wednesday, and a health problem on Thursday. They have those problems every day at the same time. And so we have to be intersectional in the way that we advance our work. And so as an organization, there are 4 areas that we focus on: climate justice and energy equity, health equity, economic inclusion, and equitable growth. And we try our best with our partners through our equity circles and other groups, whether it be in private sector and other areas, to work together to advance a racial equity agenda. So the need for an ecosystem and infrastructure on the ground, not the expectation that we can import the change makers that we need in the South from other places, but the work around building leaders who are from the South, by the South, and for the South is critical and important. And that is the work that PSC, among other things, that we try to advance, do our best to do. Tamika, thank you for letting me share.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think that's an important grounding point for us all. Mayor Ingram?
Yeah, so having currently being a beneficiary of the work and partnership with Partnership for Southern Equity, I think it's poignant for me to go ahead and interject some comments here around the 4 pillars that Nathaniel just mentioned, how they're engaging with the city of East Point around health, economic inclusion, equitable growth and opportunity. And so we are out here. There are a number of things that we've discussed. There are a number of strategies out there. We are very honored to have the expertise of PSC, but I'll just lift a couple of them to kind of share some of the strategies that have been mentioned or that we're thinking of. And so when you think about this whole idea of how does development benefit a community, oftentimes in government, when we start talking about doing things or for people, or sometimes people often want to raise this whole term of gratuity, right? Like it's gratuitous. You can't just give a gift. But if you're giving incentives, tax abatements to businesses to have them come in and no benefit to the community, I've been scratching my head lately trying to figure out how that's not a gratuity, right? And so we are working on a community benefit ordinance that will require community benefits for those anytime that we're incentivizing development. I mean, if people come in and they have all the money and everything that they need and there's no help from the government, that's one thing, but that doesn't often happen. A lot of times we are incentivizing those developments. And how do we do that? In a way that we get benefits from the community, like livable wages, like making sure there's workforce development, like making sure that the quality of life of our residents is enhanced through making our community more walkable, more mobile. And how do we even look at workforce development? So that's one area. The other is around inclusionary housing, right? So people have this phobia, I guess, around the term affordable housing at times. I don't know why, because if you have $1 million house and a mortgage, your house is affordable for you. A mortgage is an affordable housing tool. But if we have to talk about that, how do we ensure that we have housing for everyone, regardless of income level, regardless of their zip code or where they live in the community, to ensure that we have a diverse housing stock that is inclusive, and having inclusionary zoning will help us do that to promote that type of housing. And then the other is around this whole idea of, and then to that point as well, how, there are a number of people in our community who have owned their homes for 30 plus years. And as with growth, there also comes increase in value. But what can we do as a government from a legacy resident perspective to help, help them be able to manage that tax increase or tax burden that I'm sure for some it feels right. As well as, when they transfer to heirs, we help heirs with being able to maintain the property that might not have been maintained. And then the other is industrial redevelopment. How do we really look at our city before projects come, take a moment, pause and say, you know what, we have some industrial areas. Is that the highest and best use for the land now with the plan that we have moving forward? And do we have some areas that have negatively impacted the quality of life of our residents? Do we still see the legacy of maybe putting houses around areas that have industrial concerns or environmental concerns? And we can do that through our planning and zoning ordinances. And so those are the things that we're looking at. And, I can't tell you that we've figured it all out. I can tell you that we believe, and that's fundamental requirement, that you have to believe that these can be different and that we're willing to do things different, right? Willing to redevelop and revitalize differently if it means that we are going to have better outcomes for our people in our community and be able to, again, develop with our residents and not to them.
I never like to follow both Nathaniel and the good mayor because few are no more eloquent and clear than them. But I actually want to quote one of my good friends, Mio, and say this is a two-check moment, right? This is about, and I take that both literally to write a check, two checks, one that we can use today and one that can build long-term infrastructure for the type of work that we're talking about. But I also take it as a metaphor to put in the extra risk and effort and extra investment, which could be of my own privilege, the privilege of my institution, and other sorts of resources into the work in this moment, right? And that we cannot go backwards. There is no backwards, and that we can only go forwards. And so I actually really appreciate Mio's words, both in a literal sense and a metaphorical sense about how we need to double down.
And for me, one of the things that's really interesting, just based on this conversation that we have, and I appreciate the mayor's words so much in this conversation, because one of the things pre-COVID, and as we talk about like what are structural inequities that we see, what we've always been mindful of is knowing that the public sector has been absent in actually supporting and dismantling a lot of the racial inequities that exist. So like the mayor is lifting up like the way that the public sector could be in right relationship. And I think one of the things that I've noted is that pre-COVID, a lot of folks have, like within philanthropy, the folks who are like leaning in, a lot of what they've been doing is attempting to fill those gaps. So how do you build out a civil society in which Black and Brown and Indigenous people actually have voice and have power? That has been, that we know that is missing. But that infrastructure to allow them to be part of, I shouldn't even say that, the infrastructure that demands them to be able to be part of the conversation and actually defining solutions that are going to help their communities and lift up their communities, that has been absent. And where philanthropy has leaned in is trying to provide resources to build out that infrastructure. And as COVID comes online, I think less valuable lessons learned is that that investment has had multiple, has had, I was gonna say twofold, but it's been multiple fold. When we talk about mutual aid, that aid is not coming from the federal government. We are the change that we seek, and the fact that the infrastructure has been built by organizations that have been rooted in the community and larger networks that have grown out of those communities, that is the thing that is actually filling the gaps and starting and stopping the massive hemorrhaging that we're seeing on the economic side, on the health side. So if anything, if there's a takeaway that philanthropy on this call should take is, if you are in the space of transactions, what we have seen is a small investment in the South has actually been the conduit to allow for us to address a lot of the challenges that we've seen with COVID on the health and economic front. Like those organizations, those Black and Brown Indigenous organizations are the ones filling the gap. The other thing that I want to be mindful to know is like a key ingredient is moving forward is the other thing that I've seen is the ability to build out and create power from these groups, whether it's been like a Project South or a Partnership for Southern Equity or some of the work that you've seen in the Gulf South after Katrina. I am thankful that is there, because the other thing that is done is challenge philanthropy to think beyond what it can do. What is interesting in this moment for COVID is there was a push and a demand from organizations like networks like It Takes Roots, who have challenged philanthropy to go beyond how we think about what our relationship is going to be. So why are we creating these unnecessary barriers in order to have access to cash? So, and the default, which Miho sort of talked about earlier, is that, you know, we make it hard for investment in organizations such as grassroots organizations to get funding, like that's by design. Like it is by design that we are acting as gatekeepers, but what COVID has shown is that we had to actually streamline processes. So that default of the we can't is actually rhetoric. Like we actually can, and this moment has shown that it's possible. And what I would ask is that groups like, you know, It Takes Roots and many of the other folks that are on this call, like you continue to push us, because those are the things that will allow us to be, again, more in service of your needs, but also be in solidarity of what it is that you are doing. Because a lot of times, like I said, for no reason outside of design, we are acting as gatekeepers to these resources and building the necessary power in order to shift how we think about race and how race plays itself out from a structural, in a structural way. The last thing that I want to say is like, because one of the things that we've been asked is like, what is our vision for the South beyond COVID? My vision is that all of the work that has taken generations to take hold and all that imagination, how does philanthropy give space for that imagination to actually become reality? Because that is the place where we're at now. This isn't a moment where, you know, like Katrina, we saw that the house was, you know, the house was damaged, and what we were trying to do was rebuild around that and put scaffolding around a bad house. This is a moment where fundamentally all of our systems are burnt to the ground. And it's not just within Black and Brown communities, it is globally. So we have the opportunity now to rebuild something that is just. We don't have to go back to what was before. So philanthropy's role should be thinking about how do we position our allies to be able to rebuild that thing that they have been working so hard to reimagine, which is a just future.
Thank you so much.
I think one of the takeaways we've had to piggyback off of Helen is networks matter in the South. So one of the reasons we've been able to move funding quickly with minimal ask of documentation, of budgets, of widgets that we really don't need is because we've been in relationship and we've supported networks of organizations that are both have a statewide capacity, but then also have authentic and deep relationships with the decentralized groups, the smaller nonprofits, that are rooted in community, trusted by communities of color, and that are trusted by these larger organizations. So for instance, Blueprint North Carolina, which is a statewide organization, has deep relationships in the eastern part of the state. And so we were able to move money to Blueprint, who then was able to move additional support to organizations across the East that a foundation at our size, we wouldn't be able to have the capacity to move a bunch of grants to smaller organizations. And so really using the relationships that we have, but then our grantee partners have, really allowed us to sustain funding to organizations in this moment, but then also help build these networks and infrastructure so that they're able to long-term respond to the context that they're in. I think for us, more than anything that this moment has lifted up is when we ask the question about what is our response as a foundation. We relied on the grantees on the ground to share with us what they needed and to ultimately trust and understand what they need for us to then respond and trust that ultimately they're always doing the work versus us as funders just supporting it. And so I think for us as a foundation, it's, you know, the ingredients is the long-term relationship building, it's sustainable funding, it's flexible funding, and then it's risk. So we went to the board, asked the board for additional funding, doubled payout for the next year. We've done the largest amount of grant making because we have the relationships, the knowledge, and the trust of communities, and we were able to then support them how they needed it versus us creating strategies that don't align with what they have articulated of needs.
Mika, you know, when I think about strategy, you know, if I put on my philanthropic hat, I mean, the first thing we have to do is to begin to invest. And I know we talk about this a lot, but the power of unrestricted support to our groups. So I think we've got to kind of talk to ourselves about when we meet with organizations. I mean, I've had organizations come to me and prefer very specific project-based support. And, you know, I do that as well. But I just think it's important that we really, you know, emphasize the power of unrestricted support for these organizations, and how those funders that actually were already doing unrestricted support are actually, those organizations have a different type of relationship with their groups, I would assume right now during COVID, because we're not, you know, I don't have a lot of my grantees asking me like how I should pivot, because we've provided general operating support. My question to them is like, well, when are you going to do that? You don't need our permission to do that. You have the resources, and that's what the general operating support is for. Even if you have an emphasis on the environment or on health or on economic justice, it doesn't mean that those dollars can't go to support the infrastructure of that entity that's then going out and supporting the groundwork in communities. I think from a philanthropic perspective, we've got to kind of like have a real conversation around unrestricted support. We also have to have a conversation about the 95%. And I know there's been a lot of rhetoric around that. And I know that there's been, you know, a lot of, you know, conversation, but we've got to kind of now start to think through like, so what does that mean? And we kind of have to have, what's perpetuity? What is impact? From the philanthropic perspective, I think we need to have that conversation. Like, we need to ask ourselves, what is impact? What is sustainability? What is philanthropy doing if we're in partnership with the change that's happening in community? The other thing I just talk about with the nonprofits and the intermediaries like PSC and others is, particularly listening to the mayor and Nathaniel, is how do you begin to not only look at the intersection, which I think is critical, but then how do you look at that intersection of work, prioritize, but also prepare to pivot? And I think that's also a part of the intersection work. Because, you know, you're right, one day you can't, you live in a house, you have health, you have all these things, but from how do you move the work to solutions, you gotta kind of think through like, how are we pivoting now to health? I mean, it doesn't mean that you're not working on the other things, but like, how do we pivot? And how do we give the space for nonprofit organizations to pivot? And the last thing I'll just talk about, and we haven't delved deep into this, but we talk about networks and we talk about coalition building and we talk about organizing. You know, Grantmakers for Southern Progress is an amazing funder network, because not only are they bringing funders together that are doing work in the South, they are positioning the actual actors, the nonprofits, the practitioners, alongside the philanthropic organizations. That is, I'm a part of a lot of funder groups. It just doesn't happen. We have organizations that come in, we have organizations that inform, but we don't have organizations alongside philanthropy working side by side on solutions and presenting together and like really being intentional about it. So I think Grantmakers for Southern Progress is actually a brilliant solution on how we can be. And then of course it's throughout the South. So I get to learn about work that Elena's doing in North Carolina, what folks are doing in Alabama, but then not only do I get to talk to my funder colleagues, I get to talk to the folks that are actually doing the work. So I think that when we also think about lifting up solutions, we must lift up space for, Southern-based network building for folks to come in, whether you're national, local, regional, and Grantmakers for Southern Progress is that space. So, you know, as we think about other strategies for support and work, as PSC is moving these amazing issue-based agendas, we also need a place to see how that's moving across the region. And I think Grantmakers for Southern Progress is also lifting that up. So that's my kind of initial thinking on like practical strategies for philanthropy to not only show up, but show up alongside our partners that are doing the work.
So in answering this question, I was taking some notes, and a couple of things come out in my head when I think about the question to me about building an equitable South, because that's kind of the core. And I think we're all aware of the fact that there's lots of factions and groups that don't want an equitable South or equitable any place else in this country. So I think that's important. I think it's really important because of the fact, and then I'm going to get into the strategies, that when you work with a community, you have to be sensitive to the fact, and I guess I'm aware of this because of the work that I've done in other communities that don't look like where I grew up, that these people have to live there every day. Their neighbor may be somebody that doesn't like the fact that they're convening with this group that's trying to change the power structure or deal with policy or whatever it is. And they have to go to, their kids have to go to school with them. So I think the reason I'm bringing that up is because I think it's important that as philanthropists and even nonprofits, that when you work with a community, you have to be sensitive to the dynamics there, that might be different from one neighborhood to the next neighborhood. They're not all the same. And it doesn't mean you don't do the work, but I do think it's an opportunity for leadership among philanthropy in a different way by using the power, quote unquote, that we do have. The reality is many foundations, whether power is something that not necessarily that you're trying to use it in a negative way, but there's a perception. There's a perception from communities and nonprofits that a person representing a foundation has a certain level of power, if you will. And so I think using that to convene, to help convene communities, to be a part of that, but also be a part of the engagement and the discussion to help them better understand how they can deal with the challenges and issues in their community, how they can address equity by being there and being a part of not just giving a grant for the community to do something, but that sometimes maybe it's a part of you showing up and being a part of the conversation with them to help them kind of know that you're invested and that you're with them as a partner. And I think that's one of the things that's been of value to me as being in philanthropy is how you build those partnerships. A common language. One of the things that's been very clear to me, and I can only speak about the major space in which I sit most of the time, and that's in healthcare, is there isn't a common language. If you were to ask, and I did some just searching around on different websites of different health, CDC and other places, about a definition for equity, you'll find maybe 100 different definitions for equity. That's very confusing, I think, for a public layperson who is maybe a teacher at a school and you ask them to come to a community meeting and be involved in changing their community. That's very confusing for the person who's, works at the grocery store and you're asking them to come to be a part. They don't know what that means. We have to understand that part of this is an educational experience, this meaning in terms of the equity and how to get to an equitable place in the South. It's educating people to understand, and some of that is just basic level setting about what does somebody mean by equity. I venture to say if we all went to our different networks, you might get different answers from everybody you might know. And I think that's important, that we think about that. The other last two things is the unusual suspects. One of the lessons that I've learned in being in philanthropy now, some 15 years, is that oftentimes they're unusual suspects, that they may not be the person in the community who has the loudest voice or connected to a particular group or an organization, but they are people who need to be around the table. I specifically call that out when we're talking about, particularly in the South, with the Latino community in some areas. In this state, the population has exploded in terms of the Latino community. But if you were to look to see where their power is and their voice, it's often missing. It's often very much not there at the table. And so I think this isn't about necessarily one particular group. I'm just calling them out because they come to mind. But I think we have to look for the unusual suspects sometimes, even within communities of color. And that may mean not the person that necessarily shows up at every meeting or that some nonprofit knows because they worked with them. It may mean, and what I've experienced with, particularly with the rural work, is the farmer, asking him to come and asking the city council person, who happens to also be the sheriff, to come and be a part of the conversation, and I think we really have to invest in that, and I think philanthropy can take a lead on that and bring in some of what might need to happen in terms of moving towards an equitable South. So my 2 cents.
Thank you so much, Lisa. All right, so I'm so inspired by what everyone has lifted up. And I'm gonna give you each like 30 seconds to just give your final statement or final vision for where you see the South after COVID. But I just wanna reiterate from my perspective, like I was so inspired by the mayor and by what Helen said and by what all of you lifted up. But now is the day that we no longer can really afford to work in our own silos. And so this is the opportunity for us to come together and figure out how do we work alongside movement leaders and nonprofits to build that system in a way that is just and equitable for all. And so I really just appreciate everything that's been lifted up, and we're gonna make sure we leave a few minutes for one, Nathaniel to wrap up, but also to answer some of the questions that you guys have lifted.
Yes, the questions are important.
Yes, the questions are important. So it would, push y'all in 10 seconds. Give me your vision. Give me your final thoughts before we go into questions.
I'll give it a shot, Tamika.
Thank you.
These are unprecedented times, as we keep hearing so often, and I think it's time we think about taking unprecedented actions and not be so shy, not be timid, but take on that risk and the opportunity that we see in front of us.
Thank you, Miho.
I'll go. Tanae mentioned pivoting. How do we pivot to health? And I think it's realizing that equity requires addressing the social determinants of health in all that we do. So whatever the work is lifting up a social determinant or more of health. It will happen in the South, and the South will lead the way because we are focused on community and connections, which are critical to really doing this work. Say something, do something is critical. So like for me, it is speaking up and advocating for high expectation development, not the general warehouses, storages, and other things that proliferate our communities and take opportunities away, but advocating for high expectation development, and also educating, equipping, and empowering my residents and the residents within our community to be able to advocate for themselves. Because the third thing I want to lift up is if this work is going to be able to be sustained, it requires empowering the people. We have elections. I get elected every 4 years. There's an election every 2 years in my city. And so if it only rests with the elected officials, every 2 years, you're potentially looking at a reset. But if we educate, empower, and equip our residents and people in the community to understand what equity is, to be able to advocate for equity for themselves, and to be able to help ensure that that fabric of that community stays, no matter who gets elected and when, they'll have to start from that foundation and build on it.
I'll say very quickly, we have a choice right now to break the cycle of racism or perpetuate it. I would invite all of us on this call to take this, as Nathaniel coined in his article, this is a movement moment. So I would invite us to take this moment and embrace a future that is based on trust, dignity, and justice.
Thank you, Helen.
And so I would follow that by asking for folks to invest in multi-year general operating supports in the region. The region has a track record. We know what is possible in the South. And so COVID is shining yet another opportunity too. So to invest and build relationship with those of us who will always be in the region.
All right, wonderful. It's all been able to, has all shared? Yes. So we're gonna move quickly into questions. And I just wanna appreciate everything that everyone has lifted up. And there are a number of questions in the chat. Unfortunately, we will not be able to get to all of them, but please understand that this is a beginning conversation. This is not the end. And so we'll have time to really dig in collectively to figure out how we move forward and how we answer some of the questions that have been lifted up here today. And so I'm going to, this first question that's in the Q&A, I think is from Ms. Erica Holman, and it's really to the mayor. And so it says, as someone born and raised in the great city of East Point that has moved back into my childhood home to now raise my family, how will the city of East Point address growing number of property owners who are not seniors, but have inherited homes, properties from their grandparents or baby boomer parents who have passed away, and have similar challenges and barriers to infrastructure upgrades necessary to support generational wealth building via home property ownership?
And so thank you for that question, Eric. Nathaniel and I talked about this recently in the many conversations we have. They're pretty deep, provoking conversations. But, you know, as we think about the work, I think when we talk about philanthropy, that's probably an area that would be helpful, because as we, from a government perspective, think about what we can do around the tax situation that was created by, you know, growth and development. And now people are looking at, instead of taxes being $1,000, they're saying they're $3,000. Like, it's just ridiculous. Well, let me not say ridiculous. It's an excessive increase, or a very quick increase. And so what can we do regarding that? But also the very real issue of the heirs that come in and being able to take advantage of the house that their grandparents or their parents own for 30 plus years, and the equity that's built in that, and then make those investments. And so, you know, Nathaniel and I have talked about it, and I'm gonna be honest with you guys, we are building the plane while we're flying. So again, I'm not saying that we have all the solutions, but I can tell you that I am committed and open to figuring out real solutions that address the needs of real people with real issues to bring about real change. And so we will continue to lift that in our work, to figure that out. And how do we leverage networks, relationships, influence, and resources to meet those people's needs?
Thank you so much. And then the second question is, how can we be more intentional about connecting youth and parents to equity issues? And I'll pose that, it sounds like that's to all the panelists.
Well, I'll just start. I mean, the first thing that you have to do is create opportunities for those parents to be at the table. And when they do have a chance to be at the table, make sure they're provided the information and the capacity in order to know what to say and how to leverage that time that they have at the table. As an organization, we actually have initiated a youth organizing initiative called Keep That Same Energy, which is really focused on engaging historically Black colleges and universities, as well as predominantly white institutions as well, to begin the process of really building power by way of our educational system. The youth are an important component. All movements are usually led by young people. And so, again, the South has taught us that. I think a lot of people fail to realize that when Martin Luther King became the leader of the Montgomery Improvement Association, he was in his 20s. And there are many other examples of young leaders who have been in a position to lead the way. So how can we begin the process of really not just creating opportunities for those people to be at the table, but to actually put them through the proper learning and training opportunities that will equip them with the skills that they need in order to be effective, and even more so organize them in ways that will allow them to contribute to the transformational changes that we need through policy.
All right, the others want to respond, or we can move on to the next question. All right, so I think we have time for one last question. And I'm going to lift this one up. Just so many people have different voices, communities, race, gender, orientation, age, and geography within our community cause our efforts and voices to be diluted and scattered, as well as some infighting. So how do we address and repair this age-old story, and how can we have a united sound and therefore effective voice? And I think some of what we've lifted up here today through our conversation has addressed this, but I want to give the panelists an opportunity to share their thoughts.
You know, I'll just jump in and say that I was on a call yesterday with, I was listening in. I felt like I was being nosy on the conversation with Wynton Marsalis and Brian Stevenson. And I share that because Brian, who leads the Equal Justice Initiative, talks a lot about truth and reconciliation. And, you know, and of course, all of us have heard that forever. But I think hearing it maybe yesterday in the context of all the things that's been going on, particularly in Georgia, you know, we can't get to solutions without some truth telling. And we are so quick to rush to the thing, philanthropy, even a lot of our social justice leaders, without spending the time to understand how we got here. And you can't, you know, the old saying, you know, I'm from the South, so you don't know where you're going until you know where you've been. And I just feel like we, you know, a lot of the things that distract us in the solutions is not understanding how we got here. And I just feel that one of the things that we've got to invest in is not just the reckoning, not just the reparations, not just the, you know, the thing that we want to see at the end of the day, but how do we not repeat it? And so, you know, I think some of the things that we're seeing, you know, to answer all these different issues, and we also cannot minimize, you know, and bundle all these different challenges that we're facing. You know, the fight of the LGBT community is so different than the fight of Black and Brown people and Native people. And there's intersection and there's ways that we all work together and are linked, but our stories and our journeys have to be distinct, and they have to be lifted up, and they have to be celebrated, and some truth has to be told. And so, you know, a part of that is spending that time to do that. So, you know, whether it's, you know, as we think about white fragility, or we think about infighting in some of our social justice organizations, a lot of that is because we haven't started and told the truth and where we're going. So I just lift that up as a way to kind of think through how we can begin to do our work. And for those of that are in philanthropy, some of us, we know how the money came, but we don't know how the money got here. And so understanding even that would be helpful for those of us that are representing these foundations, and for those that are getting the checks. If you're getting a check from somebody and you don't understand where that money's coming from, I need you to do a little bit of work. Right. You need to understand that, because I think it will help you understand the expectations of that money. And so we just got to do a little bit of work in understanding who we are and where we've been and where we're going. So.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to pass the baton to Nathaniel to close us out. But before I do, again, I want to thank each of you for being on the call with us today. And please know that this is not a conversation. This is a continued discussion, and it's an opportunity for us to continue to be radical in our thoughts and our imagination and how we can move this work forward. So thank you all for being on with us today. And I just want to leave the last words for Nathaniel.
So before I can do anything, I have to honor my sister, Tamika Mosley, and Grantmakers for Southern Progress for her masterful facilitation of all of these cats that you had to herd today. I appreciate your facilitation of the process, and even more so what you mean to the South, not only in terms of GSP, but you as a leader. If we still have individuals who are involved in philanthropy that are on this call, the first thing that you can do, if you are committed to the conversation that we've lifted up, is to join Grantmakers for Southern Progress. That is the primary point of entry if you're serious about moving this work forward in the right way. I want to thank again the panelists who participated. I won't spend a lot of time on that. What I will say is that we're in an urgent time as a community right now. And it's not a matter of our political affiliations or our class status or whether we'll be invited to banquets anymore that should decide our ability to be courageous. Right now, it is a matter of life or death for many of the people who we say we care about. There's a level of urgency that must be attached to this work, and even more so a deep commitment to not only change, but a change that is transformational. If our goal is to be just like the people who we say we disagree with, then the change that we're pushing for is not transformational. If we're building change on top of a foundation of fear and exploitation and other isms, the same way that other groups are, then we don't deserve the influence that we're fighting for. The work that we have to do has to be transformational, and it has to be built on a different foundation. And from the perspective of the Partnership for Southern Equity and many of the individuals that are on this call, it has to be built on the transformational power of love if we are committed to really, really realizing the type of change that we want in community. So this is not the end, as Tamika alluded to or said. You know, our prayer for the article that we wrote together was that it would become more than just an op-ed, but a manifesto for individuals who believed in what we believed in. And we hope that people of the same heart and mind would gravitate towards our vision for a better South. And if you want to learn more information about the people that are on this call and organizations that they represent, the Partnership for Southern Equity will have that information available. You'll also have an opportunity, if you want to spread the word about this panel discussion for people who were not able to participate in it. We have it recorded and we'll be playing it again. But even more important, we will never, as a community, go back to the way things were. We will either go back to a worse situation or a better situation. The trajectory of our future as a nation will have to go through the South, and it's up to us as a community to decide which direction we want to go. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Great day. Take care, be safe, and we'll keep us all lifted up.
Thank you.